Well, at last, the moment that I'd been hoping for had finally happened. Not only was I connected to a barbel, this was clearly a big fish. And in that strong current, a big fish feels like a really big fish. And I didn't hold back during the fight. In that strong flow, my rod was at full test curve. I was praying all my knots held out and that little size 10 hook would hold. And I'd like to say I enjoyed the fight, but it was terrifying. Whether I landed this fish, the whole trip depended on it. I didn't quite know how big this fish was, but I knew it was the fish that we really wanted to catch. I just wanted to see it safe in the bottom of my landing net. Well, it's Specimen Series time again, and I'm back on the hunt for barbel on the River Trent. And although we've filmed on this venue a couple of times in the past, and they've been really productive trips, those bigger barbel had eluded me. And what I mean by bigger barbel are probably barbel over 12 pound. I've always caught numbers of fish and a few low doubles, but what would be really nice is to get a bigger fish on camera. And that might not seem too difficult on the Trent, but when you're on quite limited time, quite often these episodes are filmed in an overnight trip. I felt it was a little bit more of a tall order. So I had to choose the venue very wisely, and I got in contact with Tammy from Gunthorpe Weir Fishery, and she kindly invited me to fish off the island swims on the River Trent at Gunthorpe. Now, the island swims themselves have got really good track record for those bigger barbel, and I was super excited to get fishing off those swims with a chance of a nice big one for the cameras. So the first trip to Gunthorpe was planned at the beginning of October, and as I drove down the long track towards the weir and got out of the van, I was confronted with the River Trent in full flood. Now, I don't mind floodwater conditions when it comes to fishing for big barbel, but maybe sitting in a raging weir pool wasn't the best place to be in these conditions. So I was a little bit anxious to whether I'd be able to fish or not in such high water conditions. So the first thing I did before I committed to fishing was just to get a rod out of the van, put a 5-ounce lead on. I only had leads up to 5 ounce. I personally find if you can't hold with 5 ounces, you're probably putting it in the wrong part of the river. So I was looking for some slack water, maybe a crease somewhere off that raging flow where I might be able to hold with 5 ounces of lead. And off the tail of the weir, there's a big floating pontoon. The water races underneath it, causing some nice creases, and it looked my best bet of a bite. Simple running rigs with those big leads and little dumbbell hook baits, either just fished on their own or wrapped in paste, were dropped off the side of that jetty, literally lowered off the rod tip. The advantage is you can walk out on that floating jetty and place them super neat, exactly where you want them. And to my surprise, they did just hold in that flow, and I felt I was fishing quite effectively if those barbel would come on the feed. Well, once I got those rods in position and I was happy where they were, I stood next to my tripod, admiring the tips of the rods, thinking, am I fishing effectively? Is this river too high? And this could be a really challenging trip. And to my surprise, one of the rods almost straight away started thumping away in the rest, and I had a barbel on already. Well, there was me getting quite anxious. I'll be careful, there's some snags here. About the conditions, thinking I might not get a bite on this trip. And it's been out there about 5 minutes. Lovely. Well, this might only be a small barbel, but it's a really important barbel, because I was anxious with the river being as high as it is, and talking to another angler further downriver said he's only caught one barbel in 2 days, that he couldn't hold bottom with 10-ounce leads. So to get a bite this quick, regardless of the size of the fish, is a massive lift in my confidence. Well, catching that barbel so early on in the session was a huge lift in my confidence, because if I'm honest, I thought those conditions for the weir pool were almost unfishable. So it's just a case of repeating what I'd already done. I didn't feel the need to get the bait dropper out and try and introduce a load of bait into the swim. After all, I wasn't trying to catch lots of fish. It was a venue where I just wanted one bite off the right fish. So it was a case of those running rigs with the big 5-ounce leads I prefer leads over feeders, and then instead of a feeder to introduce bait into the swim, I use a mesh PVA bag which is simply hooked onto the hook. Then every time I lower the rig into position, there's another handful of bait on the spot. So every half an hour I refresh the rods to keep the bait going into the swim, and as the afternoon went on into the evening, I was feeling confident of a bite. Normally when it gets to dusk, it's prime time for a bite off a barbel, and I was really surprised that that bite didn't come in the evening, and it didn't come out through the night as well. So confidence suddenly was lowered again, but I still had the following morning to look forward to. Well, the following morning, the Weir pool looked absolutely gorgeous. We had the sunrise of all sunrises. The river had dropped a little bit and it looked good for a bite still. And after all I need on a venue like Gunthorpe is just one bite. We just need one fish to make it from a fairly desperate trip to the trip of a lifetime. So I fished as neat and effectively as I could. I stuck to those same spots at the tail of the Weir under that pontoon. After all, there wasn't really anywhere I could position a bait where I felt I'd be fishing properly. Anywhere in that really fast water on the main river, you would have needed probably 10 ounces of lead or more. And would those barbel want to be sitting in that really fast current? Surely they'd be in that slightly slacker water to the side of the Weir where I was fishing already. So I kept plugging away at those spots, hoping for another bite, hoping for that big barbel. But it soon reached dinner time. We had to be off the venue by lunchtime. But I was already planning a trip back in a few weeks' time when the river levels dropped and the river would perhaps be a little bit more kind to me, and maybe I'd get that big barbel I hoped for. Well, a couple of weeks later, I returned to the River Trent, and as I turned down the little track that follows the river above the Weir certainly looked a lot more friendly than it did on that first visit. But I was slightly anxious that that Weir still could be really high. I couldn't really tell from that first bit of river. I parked the van up next to the Weir, I walked across the lock gates, and it was a huge sigh of relief to not see a cauldron of chocolate brown water hammering through the Weir. It must have dropped more than a metre since that first trip. It looked much more friendly, and I felt miles more confident of getting more than one bite on this trip. Well, it may seem a bit odd to a few people, but although I only caught that one barbel to the left of that pontoon on the first visit, I didn't feel I'd done anything wrong. I just felt I was a little bit unlucky with the conditions. So the left-hand rod was placed almost exactly where I fished on the first trip. But because the conditions, the river had dropped a lot, the flow wasn't as fierce, this allowed me to put my right-hand rod on the right-hand side of that pontoon. Both those spots looked really good for a bite. And well, it was almost a mirror image of the first trip. The rods hadn't been out long, and straight away I was into a fish. Well, that's a quick bite for me, but it feels like either a small barbel or possibly a chub, but it's really encouraging to get a bite nice and quick. It's a chub. Well, I think my guesses are right. I can see an angry chub shaking his head down there. If I'm honest, it's just great to get a bite. Whoa there. I promise there is a chub somewhere in all that white foam. Well, although that first bite wasn't the barbel I hoped for, catching a chub meant the conditions were a lot better, and I knew if the chub were feeding that the barbel would feed as well. And it was a bite off the right hand side of the pontoon, which I couldn't even fish on the previous trip because the flow was so strong. So I felt all I needed to do was just repeat again, get the rig back in the same spot with another little mesh bag of boilies and pellets, and I either fished little dumbbells or on occasions I'd wrap the dumbbell in paste for a bit of added attraction. But I felt super confident if the chub were feeding, those barbel would come on the feed soon. Well, I've given it a couple of hours searching the swim with those PVA bags with just a chub to show for my efforts. So I think it's time to put some bait in the swim. A nice simple mix. I've got some 4mm halibut pellets, some little 2.3 sticky krill pellets, a big jar of hemp seed, and some krill active 12mm boilies. So I'm going to mix that all together in a bucket, and I'm going to walk down on that floating pontoon with my bait dropper rod, and it'll be a nice simple underarm cast with a bait dropper. I can bait up super accurate, nice and neat, and let's see if we can trigger them barbel into feeding. Well, a couple of more hours passed without any action, and I'd had a few people speak to me whilst fishing there on the island at Gunthorpe, saying I wasn't necessarily in the best peg. Quite often the swims closer to the sill of the weir can be much more productive for the barbel. On the first trip they really weren't an option due to how high the river was, but on this trip I managed to have a go in those swims, only for an hour or two, and the 5-ounce leads held nicely. And one of my hook baits was going to be one of those little dumbbells wrapped in some paste, a really high attract bait. And then the other hook bait, one of my favourites, a big cube of spam. Now most of my fishing on the River Trent has been on the tidal sections, and Gunthorpe is the non-tidal. And what that means is we haven't got the mitten crabs. If I try and use spam on my normal stretches of the River Trent, your bait has gone in no time due to those. But it was a real luxury to be able to use one of my favourite baits and fish effectively. Sadly, nothing happened in the whirlpool. I might not have gave it enough time. I had a couple of little rattles on the rod tip, and there could have been a bite on the cards, but all I could think about the whole time I was sitting there was that bait that I'd put in my original swim, and I could be missing out on a few chances. I felt there was probably barbel feeding on the loose feed, and to be quite honest, I'm quite good at trusting my own judgment, and I felt I was in the right spot and that I was fishing effectively, and I just needed to be a little bit more patient. And as the afternoon went into the evening, which is prime bite time, I needed to be back on my pre-baited spot to catch that barbel I hoped for. Well, I literally just lowered a PVA bag back on the spot out there, was walking the rod back to the tripod, and I felt a wallop as I was putting it on the tripod, and it was a small barbel or another chub, but a bite nonetheless. I'm gonna have to get down on my pontoon to try and net it. Try and keep them away from the platform. It's a really big chub. Well, if you're gonna, I'll just let him fall in the net, I think. There we go. Whoa. Oh, this was a chub specimen series, wasn't it? Well, not the barbel I'm after, but it was really good to get a bite so quickly, and maybe the fish are just coming on the feeder. If the chub are feeding, let's hope the barbel are feeding. Let's talk a little bit about my baiting approach on this trip. Let's face it, on the first trip, although the conditions were really tricky, I went in quite softly, gently with the bait, just using those mesh PVA bags and trying to nick a bite. Now that's not my normal style of fishing. With all my specimen fishing, I'm quite aggressive and I like to use bait to build the swim. And with these conditions being much kinder, now was the time to get that bait dropper out. And it's not a case of just mixing up a bucket full of bait and just bait dropping it all in the swim. It's a little and often approach, but keep it consistent. So every hour or so, I kept wandering out on the pontoon, 2 or 3 bait droppers over each rod, just to keep the bait trickling in the swim. And I still felt really confident. Although I'd only caught 2 chub, the conditions were really good. Night time's a really good time. And I felt if I just kept trickling the bait in the swim, refreshing those rods, I was super confident that we'd get a barbel or 2. It got to about 10 o'clock at night and I'd been baiting all evening, and I thought I can't do no more. I'm fishing really neatly. So I got in the sleeping bag, full of anticipation and hoping for a bite before the morning. Well, at last, the moment that I'd been hoping for had finally happened. Not only was I connected to a barbel, this was clearly a big fish. And in that strong current, a big fish feels like a really big fish. And I didn't hold back during the fight. In that strong flow, my rod was at full test curve. I was praying all my knots held out and that little size 10 hook would hold. And I'd like to say I enjoyed the fight, but it was terrifying. Whether I landed this fish, the whole trip depended on it. I didn't quite know how big this fish was, but I knew it was the fish that we really wanted to catch. I just wanted to see it safe in the bottom of my landing net. Well, I am slightly lost for words. It's been a real tough trip. Coming here a few weeks ago when the river was in full flood and barely being able to fish, then coming back and it looking so good on this trip, yet just having those 2 chub Well, how about this? 14 pound 4 of River Trent barbel. It's been a while since I've had one this big. It's an absolutely stunning fish. I'm over the moon and well worth being woken up for and having to jump out of the sleeping bag. Well, nothing else happened during the night and I got some much needed sleep. And then first thing in the morning, I was up at first light, refreshing those rods, introducing a little bit more bait into the swim. And if I'm honest, I felt super confident of another bite. Well, with all my specimen fishing, I'm a big fan of using plenty of bait. I think sometimes the best anglers are the anglers that bait up the best. That's exactly what I'm doing this morning. Before I refresh those rods, I'm going to put 5 or 6 bait droppers on both the spots to see if we can fire those barbel up and get another bite this morning. So I'll probably put another 3 or 4 of these out. It's quite important with the bait dropper that you feel it down on a tight line until it taps down on the bottom when it opens up nicely. But I'll get a few more of these out, then I'll go and put some fresh hook baits on both the rods, lower on both of these spots, and see if we get another fish. It could be on, it's gone sort of slack. Let's have a look. Yeah, there's fish on there, Chris. Well, the Cuba luncheon meat has come good. It's probably one of my favourite baits for barbel. It's a job to say how big it is because there's so much flow in this section of river. We've got a bit of extra water on. But hopefully it's another nice big one. Good. Feels nice and feels bigger than the other one. In fact, it's just so slow. The lead. So, wow. On the other rod this time. The key is to play them upriver and then let them flow down into the net. I ran down here because it felt like it had gone under the jetty. Oh yes. Well, this shows exactly why you need very strong gear when you're fishing these weir pools on the Trent. Got a 15-pound main line. I've actually put the 275 test curve rod top on these rods. They come with 2 different test curve tops. It's the Advanta twin tip barbel. And I need every pound of that test curve here. This is a big fish in a very snaggy swim. And I'm doing my best to try and get him in that net against this strong flow. I'll try the other side, Chris, because I netted that big one there, didn't I? Because I can soon, I'll try it. Just seems a bit less fierce this side. Yes, now. Oh my God. Must be what fishing for marseille's like in the rapids. Well, how about that for a perfect looking barbel? Just over 12 pound this one. And well, if that is an example of how bait in the swim can trigger the barbel into feeding, I'd had nothing since that 14 pounder in the early hours. Woke up this morning, got the bait dropper out, refreshed the rods, within 25-30 minutes, this lovely fish came along. It's been a long while since I've seen big barbel like this. We used to have a few in the Wensum, but they've sadly all gone. So I have to come to the Trent to try and find some of these. Well, before I put this rod back out, let's talk a little bit about the rig that I use for these big barbel. And the same as the hardware that I'm using, it needs to be really strong and really tough. These big barbel in this really strong current test the tackle to its limits. So I like to use a nice long hook link, and I've got 15-pound Corda IQ as the main section of my hook link. It's kind of a combi link, and I like that fluorocarbon because I find it much tougher than mono. It's quite thick, and it's that thickness that makes it withstand all the snags and the horrible things that are in the River Trent. And it's really simple. I've got 2 figure-of-8 loops, one on one end that's got an anti-tangle sleeve, and then one on this end that I simply put a little bit of putty just to tidy the knot up where I've tied the loop. Then I loop to loop a short section of either 15 or 20 pound supple braid. The reason I don't go straight through with the fluorocarbon is because of that thickness, and the rig would look quite untidy. So that last maybe 4 or 5 inches is a nice soft supple braid that gives you that slightly better presentation where the hook bait is. And then the rig on the rod itself is a simple run rig. I always use running rigs for barbel, and I've got a nice big 5-ounce big gripper lead which is holding nicely in that current. So I'm going to get this clipped back on the running rig, drop it back on that spot, and see if there's any more barbel to be caught. With the rods repositioned, I wasn't long in getting another bite that morning, but this time it was your typical barbel bite, an absolute screamer. So I grabbed the rod, carefully made my way back onto that floating pontoon, and I must admit I enjoyed playing this fish. With 2 nice fish already under my belt, I was a lot more relaxed, and it was an absolute pleasure to play. And as I got the fish closer to the pontoon, it was hidden under rafts of white foam that had formed on the surface. But as it came out from under the foam, you could see it twisting and turning in the current, and it was clearly another nice barbel. Bit of a panic-stricken net, but we got it. Well, another beautiful autumn Trent barbel, and it's a great morning when you get 3 barbel and a 10-pound 7's the smallest of the 3. Well, barbel fishing doesn't get much better than that. And I don't know whether it's the conditions that we've got on the river today, or whether it's the baiting that I've been doing, keeping the bait going in with the bait dropper, and maybe swapping to the Spammer's hook bait. But whatever it is, the barbel are definitely on the feed. Well, isn't it funny how just 2 or 3 bites can turn a session around? When I got here yesterday, the fishing seemed super tough. I was searching around the weir pool, casting PVA bags around, trying to just get a bite somewhere. I had lots of good advice from Tammy that runs the fishery and her team of bailiffs, and everyone told me a different spot to drop one here, drop one there, and I'm sure you can catch barbel all over this weir pool, and that probably is the problem. Everywhere looks good for a bite. But for me, I think the way the session turned round is I just fished more confidently this morning. I got the bait dropper out, I put more bait in. I didn't just fish for a bite, I kind of attacked the swim, and I trusted my judgment, picked 2 spots and just kept the bait going in the swim with the bait droppers. And well, it seems to have worked. I've had 3 nice barbels since the early hours this morning. Couldn't have wished for more for that nice big 14-pounder. But we've still got a couple of hours left. It's a really good fishing day today. It's overcast, it's nice and mild, the river looks spot on. Wouldn't it be nice just to get one more bite before I have to pack up? Chubzilla, chubzilla. In you go. Well, I have actually popped this chub on the scales because it looked a nice chunky one. It's gone about 5 pounds 6, and they're a lovely distraction amongst the barbel, and in this strong flow, even these chub absolutely pull your arm off. So at least it proves that there's still bites to be had. I'm sure there's some barbel out there amongst these chub, but either way, I don't mind. Chub or barbel, it's just great getting bites on the Trent. Time flies when you're having fun, and it was soon time to start packing up. We had to be off the island by a certain time in the day, but what a session it had been. Not only did I manage to catch a few barbel, but but at £14.4, that's the biggest barbel I've had for a few seasons, and to capture that moment on a Specimen Series as well, I was really pleased. And a huge thank you to Tammy for inviting us to Gunthorpe Weir and letting us fish off the island, which is an absolutely mega spot for barbel. I really enjoyed this trip. And don't forget, if you like the video, give it a like. And if you want to watch more episodes of Specimen Series, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.